It was the end of my high school state championship game and we had lost 2-1 in the pouring rain. It looked like something you would have seen in a coming-of-age movie, but this was a nightmare. My senior season was over, and I had failed to help my team reach a ring on their fingers. After that, I fell behind in academics. I didn't want to go back to club. My accolades meant nothing to me anymore, and I didn't even want to think about soccer for months. I stayed home and felt like a failure to everyone around me. Hello, everyone. My name is Jazmyn, and I'm a freshman soccer player at Boise State University. And welcome to Beyond the Ball. In today's episode, I want to talk about the difficulties and the stigma that student athletes face when it comes to their mental health. Being a student athlete is like a full-time job. You have to balance your sport, your schoolwork, and social life. Over the years, student athletes have been suppressed from showing and talking about their mental health over the stigma that athletes are tough and that they have it all and that they shouldn't be unhappy. I want to shed some light on this myth and share the truth about mental health in student athletes. To get more in touch with another student athlete's experience, I interviewed Paige Sim, a senior soccer player at Loyola University in Maryland. In the interview, I wanted to touch upon the adversities she had overcome from the time she was a youth club player to her final years as a Greyhound. As a club athlete in the midst of a recruiting process, Paige explained how her height stunted her recruitment from colleges. She said, quote, "Most colleges were looking for 6-foot-tall athletic goalkeepers, and I was denied a lot. I started doubting myself, and this affected my athletic performance," end quote. This plays into the perfectionist perspective of a student athlete and how they're always striving for success. The moment they seem to reach a bump in the road, it affects performance abilities. Once she found Loyola, Maryland, Sim explains that she chose the school 2,300 miles away from home because it was an opportunity for a fresh start. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Sim. She suffered the pressures of playing at a collegiate level while also balancing her academics. Sim explained, quote, at balancing academics and athletics, became a lot to handle. I developed anxiety and it was hard to improve both of my performances adequately, end quote. The stresses of keeping a strong balance between two worlds can become paralyzing when trying to excel in both fields. With Sim's interview, a new perspective has brought about in the world of student athletes. You always hear about how they may struggle with mental health, but once you hear an athlete talk about their personal experiences, it becomes so real to everyone involved. To relate this to the Boise community, I surveyed about 50 student athletes, 25 male and 25 female. In the survey, 40% of males and 65% of females said that they felt a crippling anxiety when trying to balance school and sports. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being almost every single day, 75% of athletes scored a 4 on how often they felt depressed, with a 4 being at least a couple times a week. I was actually really surprised by these results, as I didn't know that the majority of athletes at Boise State felt depressed and anxious while playing their respective sports. Student athletes have started to feel isolated, and the stigma of mental health has become more known among the athletic community. Anxiety is a difficult subject to tackle in student athletes. This isn't the typical butterflies you feel when you're about to play in a big game. This is so much more. In a podcast hosted by Dr. Josie Nicholson, a sports psychologist at Ole Miss, she and several other mental health professionals talk about different mental health issues among student athletes. In the episode So Effing Perfect, Dr. Nicholson, alongside Dr. Riley Nichols, tackles the issue of perfectionism and how it can become an unhealthy mindset for athletes. Dr. Nichols says that, quote, "Athletes striving for success and wanting to improve is admirable, but those feelings of inadequacy and fears of not being good enough can interfere with athletic performance," end quote. Through the podcast, the two professionals touch on athletic performance, and this performance problem can interfere with academic performances as well. Dr. Nicholson adds, quote, "I've had athletes come to me suffering from severe anxiety because they're being haunted by mistakes and fears of losing. Not only does it hinder their performance, but it also robs their joy of the sport," end quote. The episode goes into detail about perfectionism and how it affects student athletes everywhere because they're so eager to please everyone around them, but they never focus on pleasing themselves. The pressure becomes so overwhelming that athletes start to come down on themselves with a fear of failure. This in turn affects the way that they play and how they perform academically as well. Sometimes it affects their social lives as they become crippled with anxiety. I reviewed a journal article written by Patrick M. Whitehead, head of the Department of Sociology and Psychology at Albany State University. The article is more of a psychological look at student athletes as a whole and dives into the minds of how they function. It maintains an emphasis on the performance of student athletes and how their behaviors are a direct reflection of their performance. The article's main focus is to explain how student athletes' behaviors are existential, meaning that the sport and behaviors are viewed as a whole. In the article, the authors write, quote, "In performance, the body is a psychological machine that can and should be manipulated with expertise. If an athlete fails to excel, this is akin to an ethical failure, such as poor planning, time management, or decision-making, lack of resolve, fortitude, strength, and so on, end quote. Student athletes are like a well-oiled machine, and when one aspect of the machine is broken or flawed, the whole project falls apart. In non-metaphorical words, if an athlete is struggling in one field of their job, such as academics, training, etc., then their performance and behaviors both suffer simultaneously. Student athletes consider their sport a job, and if they are failing to perform well in their job, they won't play, and this affects their everyday life. Speaking from experience, they become discouraged and then fail to perform academically or socially, which may lead into depression and/or anxiety. The overwhelming anxiety that athletes may feel can be a direct correlation to depression. In my survey, 65% of student athletes, male and female, said that their anxiety with school, sports, and their fear of failure led to them feeling depressed. In a journal article called, quote, Student Athletes and Mental Health Experiences, end quote, written to shed light on the underutilization of mental health resources at a collegiate level for student athletes, it explains the prevalence of mental health problems and how it is a growing issue among student athletes. The authors write, quote, nearly a quarter of student athletes across all three divisions in NCAA reported being exhausted from the mental demands of their sport, end quote. Depression among student athletes are reported and diagnosed significantly less than non-student athletes. In fact, if athletes are diagnosed with depression or anxiety, there's a lack of resources provided for the athletes to improve their situation. The article also states that, quote, student athletes can be particularly at risk for depressive symptoms when they become injured, especially if their self-esteem is directly tied to their identity as a student athlete, end quote. Injury is the most common reason for student athletes to develop depression because most athletes feel that their sport is part of their identity. If they lose that sport, they've lost themselves in the process. This goes to prove that student athletes struggle with depression, but they lack the proper resources in order to improve their situations, such as sports psychologists and therapists. I read a journal entry with more statistical evidence in the Psychi Journal of Psychological Research. The main purpose is to explain the dynamics of a coach-athlete relationship and how it benefits an athlete's performance on and off the field. The study investigates if the relationships benefit a student athlete's mental health as well. The article talks about a relationship between coaches and their student athletes at a collegiate level. The balances between these relationships and athletes' mental health become a conflict within each dynamic. The authors gave a questionnaire to random student athletes, male and female, to describe their relationships with their coach and if they have suffered any mental health issues while playing their respective sports. The data showed that 23% of male athletes and 56% of female athletes said they were close with their coach, and only 10% of the males and 8% of the females stated that they felt emotionally stable during their careers. This makes sense that an athlete's closeness with their coach would directly affect their mental health, but there are also outside factors that can be considered, like additional resources provided for the student athletes. Resources for student athletes are few and far between. Boise State has a sports psychologist available for athletes, but other schools may not have the same resources available to them, especially if student athletes don't specifically feel comfortable talking to their own coaches, which is something that in turn also affects their mental health because they feel like they have to keep it inside. Student athletes struggle with mental health issues just like most people. The stigma around how athletes need to be tough and have thick skin has diminished the courage for student athletes to speak up and talk about how they feel. I discovered that many student athletes struggle with depression and anxiety, but they lack the resources to deal with these issues. This is a topic that relates close to home for me, as I have struggled, especially this year being away from home and adapting to my freshman year. To end this on a positive note, there are resources for student athletes here at Boise State. The Bronco Bold initiative here is an outlet for the whole community of student athletes, and our sports psychologist, Stephanie Donaldson, is available through her email to schedule an appointment at stephaniedonaldson@boisestate.edu. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope this has impacted your view on student athletes and the stigma around their mental health issues.